Born Li Yunhe, trained as an actress, reborn as Jiang Qing, and remembered as the infamous Madame Mao, she played every role history would let her, and then some, it wouldn't. From a stage-lit dreamer in war-torn China to the architect of the Cultural Revolution's nightmare, Jiang Qing rose through propaganda, performance, and sheer political vengeance. Silenced for 30 years, she came back with a voice sharpened into a weapon and wielded it with operatic fury. Her story is not a biography. It's a cautionary epic of power, ego, ideology, and revenge where the applause always came at someone else's expense. This is the tale of the woman who mistook revolution for a spotlight and turned a nation into her stage. Jiang Qing, born Li Yunhe in 1914 in Jiang, Shandong province, came from a deeply unstable family background. Her given name, meaning crane in the clouds, stood in sharp contrast to the grounded and often grim realities of her early life. Her parents had a significant age difference, her father being over 30 years older than her mother, resulting in a marriage strained by generational and temperamental divides. Her father was reportedly a violent alcoholic who, when Li was 6, abandoned the family. This left her mother with limited options for survival and ultimately led her into sex work to support herself and her daughter. Li spent much of her early childhood waiting at home while her mother returned each night with a new companion. As time passed and her mother began to focus on more financially stable men, Li was placed in the care of her maternal grandparents in Jianan, the provincial capital. These early experiences profoundly shaped Li's worldview, witnessing the vulnerability and social dependence of women under a patriarchal system instilled in her a lasting resentment toward traditional Chinese values, particularly those that gave men total control over women's lives. By the age of 10, she had developed a strong-willed and argumentative nature. Her refusal to conform often led to social isolation and bullying by her peers. Frustrated by the constraints of her environment and desperate to find a space where her outspoken personality would be recognized rather than punished, she dreamed of escape. When a traveling theater troupe arrived in Jianan, 14-year-old Li saw an opportunity to leave behind her constrained upbringing. Believing that the stage might offer the visibility and freedom she craved, she chose to run away with the troupe, setting the course for a life driven by performance, ambition, and eventually politics. A coincidental turn of events changed the course of her early ambitions. Her grandparents, having enjoyed a previous performance by the theater troupe, purchased tickets upon learning the group was returning to Gan. They were shocked to see their granddaughter step on stage during the show, unaware that she had joined the troupe. After the performance, they went backstage to confront her and insisted she return home. Li responded with a dramatic and emotional plea, insisting that being separated from the stage would break her heart. Her reaction convinced her grandparents of her sincerity and determination. In response, they offered a compromise. She could return home and live under their supervision. And in return, they would support her formal training by enrolling her in the Academy of Performing Arts in January. Thus, she began her life on stage, trading a future of arranged silence for one of scripted chaos. Soon, however, she discovered that casting decisions were often influenced not by talent, but by sexual exploitation, a practice commonly referred to as the director's casting couch. As she entered adolescence, she was invited to audition in a context that strongly suggested such exploitation. Having grown up aware of the abuses her mother had endured, Li approached the situation with suspicion and caution. Nevertheless, she understood that conforming to such expectations could determine whether or not she advanced in the industry. For a young girl who had experienced emotional neglect, the attention and applause of an audience offered a powerful sense of validation. And she realized she faced a pivotal choice. Surrounded by students who were cleaner, richer, and more demure, Li had the unmistakable air of someone who didn't just bring baggage. She brought matching emotional luggage sets. Her clothes were a fashion statement in poverty chic, threadbare, ill-fitting, and probably older than some of her classmates. She didn't blend in. She clashed. Inferiority was the perfume of the hour. But instead of crumbling under the scent, Li opted for a strategy that would later become her signature move. Fake it with ferocity. She layered arrogance over insecurity like stage makeup and leaned into contrarianism with the enthusiasm of someone who knew that if you couldn't be liked, you could at least be memorable. Feisty to a fault and argumentative by choice, she stirred up drama in a drama school, an achievement in itself. Yet, despite her social grating and rebellious flair, Li's talent was undeniable. Even her critics had to admit that when she stepped on stage, the theatrics came naturally and not just the off-stage kind. But the spotlight was dimmed in 1930 when the Academy shuttered, sending its budding performers into Beijing's unforgiving art scene. There, reality checked in with a thick accent, literally. Their provincial Jinan dialects were considered backwater babble in the capital, and Li found that talent didn't translate when wrapped in the wrong phonetics. With dreams deferred and money evaporating faster than audience applause, she retreated to Jinan. Emotionally jet-lagged and creatively bankrupt at 16, perhaps nudged or shoved by her ever-practical grandparents, she gave marriage a shot. Her first husband, presumably chosen for his proximity rather than passion, came with in-laws who expected a beautiful domestic doll and got a flamethrower in a kippo. Her mother-in-law quickly declared her lazy, which in Chinese mother-in-law speak is code for not enslaved enough. Li did not take kindly to the whole know-your-place philosophy. She railed, raged, and rejected her designated household rank with the same energy she once used to reject bad monologues. And so the marriage imploded faster than a paper set in a monsoon. It lasted only a few months, but served its purpose. Li walked away with clarity, a bruised ego, and the satisfying knowledge that she was categorically not housewife material. After tossing her first marriage into the matrimonial shredder, Li grabbed what little she owned and hit the road for Qingda University, an institution celebrated not just for its academic clout, but also for its unapologetic passion for theater and the arts. It was here, amid scholarly debates and dramatic dialogue, that she found more than just stage lights. She fell head over high heels for a radical left-wing student whose heart beat to the sound of revolutionary anthems. In a modern twist on courtship that required no official paperwork, the pair exchanged vows in a ceremony that was as informal as it was incendiary. But the script of revolutionary love has its share of tragic interludes. When her dashing partner landed behind bars for his political fireworks, Li was left reeling in sorrow. The pain was compounded upon his release, and he bailed on their domestic drama to pursue his own radical agenda. Alone, heart bruised, and a little wiser to the fickle nature of romantic alliances, Li wasn't one to linger in the limelight of despair. Instead, she mustered the resilient spirit of a seasoned actor and packed her emotional bags once more. With Shanghai's brilliant neon promise beckoning like the ultimate marquee of reinvention, she set off for the big city. Welcome to the 1930s Shanghai, where the jazz was hot, the politics hotter, and moral ambiguity ran on tap. Nicknamed the Paris of the East, the city was a riotous stew of cultures, cabarets, and collapsing empires. It was also one of the rare places in China where women could be more than obedient daughters or decorous wives. For an ambitious stage-obsessed rebel like Li, it smelled like liberation. At this existential fork in the road, Li saw two signposts. Follow in her mother's stiletto footsteps and become a courtesan dependent on men's wallets and whims, or break onto the silver screen as a movie star idolized and self-directed. She picked the latter, proving once again that she preferred the camera's cold gaze to a client's wandering eye. Breaking into Shanghai's underground theater scene, she scraped by performing in minor productions for majorly minor pay. But she also threw herself into political rebellion, distributing anti-government leaflets and performing in anti-establishment plays. She might have imagined herself as a tragic heroine of the people, but in the eyes of the authorities, she was just another troublemaker in lipstick. The state didn't offer reviews, just jail time. In 1934, she was tossed into prison for subversive activities and spent 3 months enjoying the hospitality of the Chinese penal system. While the harsh conditions chipped away at her health, she belted out Chinese opera arias like a diva in solitary confinement, because if you're going to suffer, you might as well do it in key. Upon release, she decided to rebrand. Goodbye Li Yun. Hello Lan Ping. A name that means blue apple. Equal parts poetic and mysterious. Reinvention, after all, was cheaper than therapy. Her gamble paid off. In 1935, Lan Ping landed a breakout role in Ibsen's Ad Doll's House, the Norwegian domestic drama that might as well have been autobiographical at this point. Playing Nora, the woman who walks out on a suffocating marriage to a controlling older man, Lan Ping didn't just act the part, she was the part. Audiences wept, critics raved, and directors came flocking. Scripts in one hand and offers in the other. But there was a catch, as always. The casting couch loomed yet again. In an industry where actresses were often treated like actresses by day, escorts by night, the subtext was always unsubtle. Sleep your way to stardom or sleep on the streets. Lan Ping, however, decided she'd rather be poor than pliable. Fueled by a growing feminist consciousness and sheer disdain for being anyone's object, she refused to pay for fame with her dignity. She wasn't going to let her body be a stepping stone. Unless, of course, she was stomping on the patriarchy with it. To a point, Lan Ping's defiance paid dividends. With her photogenic features, long cascading hair, and an independent streak, she stood out like a firecracker in a field of sparklers. While her contemporaries were perfecting the art of obedience, she offered something new. A woman who wasn't afraid to say her lines and rewrite them when necessary. Her magnetic presence earned her acclaim on both stage and screen, not to mention a slew of marriage proposals that ranged from mildly flattering to absolutely not. But none of her performances ever quite touched the raw brilliance of her turn as Nora in A Doll's House, where the art imitated her life so closely it probably needed a restraining order. That performance didn't come from rehearsals. It came from a lifetime of bristling under someone else's script. During her 4-year Shanghai run, Lan Ping got romantically tangled with Tang Na, an art critic with a pen dipped in praise and eventually poison. He reviewed her films, then reviewed her life, and finally married her. Their relationship was passionate in the way tornadoes are passionate, dramatic, destructive, and loud. Unsurprisingly, it imploded with Lan Ping walking out, having realized she was more suited for political revolutions than emotional ones. This breakup, unfortunately for her, came with a press tour. Tang Na's buddies in the journalism world, armed with broken hearts and even more broken ethics, took to their typewriters with the zeal of men avenging a friend scorned. Lan Ping was swiftly recast in the media as a cold, calculating career-climbing villainess. Less woman, more walking ambition in high heels. The newspapers didn't just blacken her name. They took it out back, buried it, and danced on the grave. Tired of playing the villain in someone else's drama, Lan Ping clapped back with an essay titled My Life, part manifesto, part burn book. It laid bare the exploitative underbelly of the film industry and criticized the way it devoured individualism for breakfast. She called out the same system that had once handed her a script and a smile, only to demand she leave her soul at the door. In short, she'd found her voice, and it wasn't reading lines anymore. It was writing them. Then came 1937, and with it, the final curtain call for Shanghai's golden age. The Japanese invaded, and the city froze in time, its neon glamour extinguished by military boots and gunfire. For Lan Ping, the invasion wasn't just a geopolitical crisis. It was a plot twist. The movie career, already wounded, took its last breath. And like any seasoned performer, she packed her bags and vanished into the wings, specifically to Yan'an, the Communist Party's dusty headquarters in Shunyi province. At 24, Lan Ping was once again reinventing herself. 2 failed marriages, 1 cancelled film career, and a smoldering sense of purpose in tow. She turned to politics. In politics, she saw something that the stage had never quite delivered. Not just admiration, but transformation. The power not just to perform, but to command. And right on cue in the smoke and slogans of Yan'an, she would meet the man who would give her the biggest stage yet and a front-row seat to history, tragedy, and absolute power. After arriving in Yan, the wartime base of the Chinese Communist Party, Lan Ping initially found herself continuing in the familiar role of actress performing in revolutionary plays. Though she had hoped that her relocation would mark a transition into more serious political engagement, she instead found herself stuck in what felt like a repetitive cycle. The revolutionary theater, which had once seemed like a stepping stone, now resembled a treadmill. Despite her growing disillusionment, her performances, though not especially distinguished, caught the attention of a significant figure, Mao Zedong, the Communist Party leader. Mao, already a father of 8 and married to her Zhen, a respected revolutionary who had marched thousands of miles alongside him during the Long March, became enamored with Lan Ping. His attraction led to the beginning of a romantic relationship between the two. Their affair quickly sparked controversy. Mao's personal life had long been a subject of internal concern, but this particular relationship was especially sensitive. Many party members expressed open disapproval, viewing Lan Ping as politically opportunistic and accusing Mao of recklessness. Criticism intensified as some cadres accused Mao of being a sexual predator while Lan Ping was labeled disparagingly a political climber and prostitute. Despite the backlash, Mao's dominant status within the party hierarchy shielded both of them. His personal charisma and revolutionary legacy rendered him effectively untouchable. In a dramatic meeting with senior party officials, Mao is said to have insisted that he could not continue to lead the revolution without Lan Ping by his side. Given his stature, the leadership reluctantly conceded, but they imposed strict conditions. Among these was a particularly consequential demand directed at Lan Ping. If she wished to remain with Mao, she would have to withdraw entirely from political life for 30 years. For the 24-year-old Lan Ping, who had long aspired to political influence, this condition amounted to an ideological exile. And yet, she agreed. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was the long game. On Mao's advice, Lan Ping rebranded herself yet again. This time adopting the name Jiang Qing, meaning green waters. It had a poetic ring to it. Sure. Though in hindsight it sounds suspiciously like a laundry detergent. Along with the name came a new look. Out went the flowing locks of Shanghai glamour. In came a close-cropped boyish cut, less movie star, more revolutionary in turn. She took up the role of beautiful consort like a method actor prepping for the most tedious part of her career. But within that quiet wife persona, a storm was brewing. Jiang couldn't help but feel she had wandered back into Ibsen's A Doll's House. Only this time, without the option to slam the door and leave, condemned to silence for 30 years, she was expected to keep her revolutionary opinions to herself and stick to embroidery, child-rearing, and the occasional politically acceptable grimace. It was a bitter pill for someone whose identity had always been a heady cocktail of ambition, defiance, and eyeliner. But then came the birth of her daughter, Li Na. A moment that jolted Jiang Qing into something resembling renewed purpose. She began to see her position not just as a gilded cage, but as a very strategic nest. Slowly, methodically, she began to reclaim her voice. What began as cautious confidence soon snowballed into outspoken outbursts, leaving party officials deeply uncomfortable and nostalgically longing for the days when the chairman's wife merely glared from the sidelines. Domesticity fit her about as well as peasant garb on a red carpet. Stripped of political influence, she redirected her energy toward projects with the ideological depth of a puddle. So when a film director suggested making a documentary about the revolutionary power couple, Jiang Qing jumped at the chance like a starving actress spotting a camera crew. She delivered a polished, passionate, award-worthy performance. Mao, on the other hand, looked like someone had tranquilized a statue. The final verdict, Jiang dazzled, Mao dozed, and the film was promptly shelved. The revolution evidently would not be televised. Over time, Jiang's frustrations fermented into something far stronger. Ideological obsession with a bitterness chaser. She clung to communist doctrine like it was a script she wasn't allowed to read aloud, all while smoldering with resentment at the men who enforced her decades-long silence. Her rage, like her hair, was now tightly controlled, waiting patiently for the day it could erupt on cue. Meanwhile, the party's triumphs were crumbling under the weight of its own slogans. On October 1, 1949, the Communists declared victory over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and launched the People's Republic of China. Cue fireworks, parades, and mass disillusionment. Mao took the helm as chairman, hailed as a revolutionary godhead, but promptly steered the ship straight into the iceberg of the Great Leap Forward. In one of history's darkest experiments in forced modernization, industry was rammed into rural villages, crops were ignored in favor of fantasy steel production. And the result was one of the worst famines in human history. Up to 30 million people died, proof that if you're going to leap, maybe check where you're landing. When the campaign finally imploded under its own bloated ambition, Mao's colleagues had seen enough. They didn't oust him outright. After all, treason isn't great for one's pension, but instead gave him a nice symbolic title and shoved him aside like a dusty bust of Lenin. They appointed themselves the real power brokers, imagining they'd retired Mao to the ideological gift shop. But what they forgot was that behind Mao stood a woman with 30 years of bottled rage, theatrical training, and a flair for the dramatic. With Mao's grip on power slipping and the party attempting to put Grandpa Revolution out to ideological pasture, Jiang Qing made her grand return, re-entering stage left from Shanghai, where she had been revisiting old haunts, rekindling theater world connections, and generally behaving like someone who had been plotting Act 3 of her life while everyone else thought the show was over. Her time in the city wasn't just nostalgic. It was strategic. And it wasn't tea she was sipping in the opera houses. It was intel. Back at Mao's side, Jiang Qing found the romance had fizzled, which wasn't surprising. Their relationship by now was less husband and wife and more dictator and political ghostwriter. Mao had long since redirected his affections to rotating cast of fresh-faced rural Anjanus, recruited straight from the fields and allegedly straight into bed. Jiang accepted this arrangement with the icy detachment of someone who understood the real power wasn't under the sheets. It was in the scripts. And so she handed him one, a seemingly innocent play she claimed was subversive. It dared to portray authority figures in a less than reverent light. To Jiang, this was her cue. She and Mao began discussing how dangerous culture could be when it wasn't properly curated. Plays, novels, opera was now suspect. Art wasn't a mirror anymore. It was a weapon, and Jiang was ready to wield it. In 1966, the couple launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, a misnamed exercise in mass hysteria that made previous purges look like minor casting changes. For Mao, it was a political reboot, a way to stomp back onto the stage after being pushed into symbolic semi-retirement. For Jiang, it was her long-delayed solo act. Her 30-year political muzzle was off, and she was ready to scream. Appointed deputy director of the Cultural Revolution, Jiang was finally free to speak, and what she said was usually terrifying. Mao had effectively released a monster. Joining forces with three equally zealous comrades, Jiang Chuno, Yaoan Yuan, and Wang Hongwen, Jiang formed the now infamous Gang of Four. Together they turned China into a national theater of cruelty where ideology was a blood sport and dissenters were props in a tragic comic performance of state violence. Their mission to seize control of policy from the conservative faction led by Deng Xiaoping and usher Jiang Qing into the role of Mao's political heir. That's right. After decades of pretending to be a silent spouse, she now wanted the top billing, curtain call, and all the standing ovations. During the Cultural Revolution, China's educational institutions were effectively dismantled. Senior schools and universities were closed, halting formal education for millions of students. In their place rose the Red Guards, a mass movement of predominantly young people, many in their teens, who had known only communist rule and were ideologically shaped by state propaganda. Numbering in the millions, the Red Guards rapidly became a dominant force, at times wielding more practical authority than the official military. The Cultural Revolution's ideological thrust soon turned inward, targeting veteran members of the Communist Party itself. Those considered part of the old guard were labeled revisionists, enemies of revolutionary purity. Under party direction, the Red Guards were mobilized to eradicate all traces of bourgeois, feudal, and traditional culture. This included intellectualism, religious practices, Confucian values, and any perceived symbols of privilege. The result was a nationwide campaign of persecution and destruction. Teachers, once pillars of Chinese society, were publicly humiliated, tortured, and in many cases, killed. Schools at all levels, including junior institutions, were shut down. Individuals from so-called exploiting classes, those with ties to landowning, scholarly, or professional backgrounds, were subjected to public degradation, which often included having their heads partially shaved and being drenched in ink. Tens of thousands, possibly more, were sent to re-education through forced labor in rural camps where conditions were harsh and mortality rates high. At the same time, cultural relics, historical texts, religious icons, and art were destroyed in vast quantities as the Red Guards, driven by ideological fervor, and often lacking historical understanding, sought to erase what they believed were counter-revolutionary remnants. Jiang Qing, once the stifled wife, now the iron-fisted dramaturge of destruction. Whatever early dreams she may have had of feminist reform or worker empowerment had long since dissolved in the blood-streaked pages of revolutionary fervor, with unimaginable power finally in her hands. She became cold, calculating, and chillingly indifferent to the human toll. Mass persecution wasn't collateral damage. It was a feature. While the Cultural Revolution raged and China's intellectual and cultural foundations were being reduced to ideological rubble, Jiang Qing was multitasking like a tyrant with a to-do list and a very sharp pen. She expanded her influence beyond political purges by aggressively reshaping China's cultural landscape. As part of her broader ideological campaign, she worked to rewrite the endings of contemporary plays, novels, and operas to conform to revolutionary doctrine. In addition to altering existing works, she commissioned new literature, theater, and music that reinforced the values and propaganda of the Cultural Revolution. These productions, often rigid and didactic, were designed to serve not as entertainment, but as tools for political indoctrination. The official press responded with glowing praise for these state-sanctioned works, and Jiang made strategic use of this coverage. Behind the scenes, it appeared that she was also settling old scores. Many of the cultural elites she targeted, directors, writers, film executives, and politicians, were individuals who had previously slighted her during her early career in Shanghai, or who had been connected to her second husband, Tang Na, whose literary circle had once been publicly critical of her. Using her newfound authority, Jiang subjected these former colleagues and critics to public humiliation, professional ruin, and in some cases, political persecution. As she traveled across the country giving speeches, Jiang cultivated the persona of an experienced political figure, adopting the rhetorical style of an impassioned orator. Her speeches were designed for theatrical effect, carefully structured to sway audiences with emotional highs and lows. To the public, she presented herself as an extension of Mao himself, and comparisons to the chairman, however exaggerated, became part of the public script. In many cases, these sentiments were echoed out of fear, not admiration, as open criticism of Jiang Qing could result in severe consequences. In the late 1960s, Jiang achieved a major milestone in her political ascent. She was appointed as the first woman to sit on the Politburo, the top decision-making body of the Communist Party. The woman who once couldn't get a decent line in a student play now held real terrifying power. Proof that hell hath no fury, like an actress turned ideologue with a 30-year grudge and a direct line to the chairman. As the 1970s dawned on a China still coughing up the ashes of the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Qing was racing against time. With Mao 20 years her senior and increasingly wheezing his way toward the grave, Jiang operated like a woman who knew the final curtain was dropping and still had 3 acts to cram in. Her greatest fear wasn't death. It was irrelevance. And so she roared louder, burned brighter, and dared the Communist Party to come and stop her. By 1974, Jiang had stopped pretending to care about discretion. She was openly taking lovers, flaunting her flings like revolutionary trophies and rebranding promiscuity as feminist practice. A woman's right to choose, she seemed to say, should extend all the way to her bedroom, and preferably several. To the party, this was scandalous. To Jiang, it was Tuesday. Increasingly unaccountable and unhinged, she strutted through state functions like a diva on the brink of a nervous breakdown. She granted a rogue interview to a foreign journalist without Mao's permission. In it, she pitched herself as a global leader because why not? If delusion was a crime, Jiang Qing was already on death row. The faux pas didn't stop there. Her most visually offensive sin. signing autographs in red ink, a color traditionally reserved for emperors. It wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a middle finger to tradition and a neon sign screaming, "I'm not done yet." Whether it was an act of disdain or yet another theatrical flourish from a woman addicted to her own legend, the message was clear. Jiang Qing still believed she was destined to rule, and she was willing to die or worse embarrass everyone to get there. But backstage the revolution was falling apart, even the Red Guards were getting restless. The very youth who smashed temples and terrorized teachers in her name were now sick of the chaos. By early 1976, martial law was declared to restore order, effectively ending a decade of national psychosis. Mao slunk into the shadows, battered and exhausted. Jiang, however, could not hide. She had taken every bow, every ovation, and now the audience wanted a refund. On September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong died, and with him the last thin veil of protection between Jiang and the wrath of the nation. With no clear successor, power was up for grabs. The Gang of Four, Jiang, and her three revolutionary co-stars plotted military coups in Shanghai and Beijing. A move so tone-deaf it could have been choreographed by a blindfolded goose. Enter Deng Xiaoying, the quiet pragmatist with impeccable timing. On the 6th of October, guards burst into Jiang's quarters and arrested her mid-script, hauling her off to Chin Chong prison, where she'd sit for 5 years, presumably with a lot of time to reflect. When the trials finally arrived, China was in no mood for nuance. Still shell-shocked from a decade of ideological carnage, the public couldn't bring themselves to criticize the late chairman. Mao had, after all, been sold as the sun in every sky. But his wife, oh, they had notes. Jiang Qing was blamed for everything the nation couldn't or wouldn't lay at Mao's feet. She became the national scapegoat in lipstick. The embodiment of every excess, every cruelty, every revolutionary fever dream, turned nightmare. Her final title, the White-Boned Demon. During her trial, Jiang Qing maintained that she bore no independent responsibility for the events of the Cultural Revolution. Her defense was blunt and unapologetic. "I was Chairman Mao's dog," she told the court. "Whomver he asked me to bite, I bit." With that, she attempted to shift the blame to Mao Zedong, portraying herself as a loyal subordinate rather than a principal architect of one of modern China's most traumatic political movements. In 1981, Jiang Qing was found guilty of counter-revolutionary crimes and sentenced to death. The sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment, sparing her from execution, but condemning her to a long, humiliating descent from power. For the next decade, she lived under strict surveillance, a fallen icon trapped inside the machinery she once commanded. In her later years, Jiang's health deteriorated rapidly. At 77, she was diagnosed with throat cancer and transferred to a hospital for treatment. On April 14, 1991, she was found dead in a bathroom, an abrupt, unscripted departure from a woman who spent her life choreographing every scene. One final act of control, perhaps, from someone who had never tolerated being directed by anyone else. Whether she ever understood the magnitude of her crimes, the millions persecuted under her ideological crusades, the lives broken in service of her rage, is difficult to say. Remorse was never among her qualities, and self-awareness had never been part of her repertoire. Even her supposed feminism was a performance at best. She claimed to speak for women's liberation, yet wielded the rhetoric not to uplift, but to punish. Anyone who dared to suggest she belonged offstage rather than in the spotlight was swiftly exiled, disgraced, or erased. She wasn't fighting for equality. She was fighting for dominance, revolutionary language draped over personal ambition. Even Mao, not exactly a gentle judge of character, once called her a paper tiger, loud and theatrical, destined to crumble under pressure. But on that point, he misread her. She wasn't fragile, she was volatile, a human Molotov cocktail made of wounded pride, stage training, and revolutionary fervor. Silenced for years, she returned not with measured reform but with scorched earth vengeance. In the end, Jiang Qing obtained everything she had ever chased: influence, notoriety, and a nation forced to watch her every move. What she failed to account for was that history, unlike propaganda, has a long memory and no editor. And in its final judgment, she stands not as a heroine, but as a cautionary tale written in red ink.